Welcome to today's webinar, Bring Back Main Street with Small-Scale Manufacturing, the Who, the Why, and the How, hosted by the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the US EPA Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website, smartgrowth.org, that serves as your one-stop on the web for the most current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. We provide news and information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Clearinghouse on smart growth topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will post it on our website in the next couple of days under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and subscribe to our e-newsletter to get the latest news and information about smart growth and to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also find out about planning initiatives and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your ASCP credits, visit the American Planning Association website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Bring Back Main Street with Small-Scale Manufacturing, the Who, the Why, and the How. You can also search for event number 918-8561. So to get us started, today our speaker is Ilana Preuss. Ilana is the founder and CEO of Recast City, LLC, a consulting firm that works with real estate developers, city and other civic leaders to integrate manufacturing space for small-scale producers into redevelopment projects and place-based economic development. She supports businesses and organizations to develop strategies with measurable and achievable outcomes. In her national practice, she works with real estate developers, foundations, city planning, and economic development offices. With mayors, she develops demand analyses, economic development strategies, and business retention and planning policies. Her technique of intensive one-on-one engagement with local business owners and other stakeholders provides clients with a deep understanding of local challenges and opportunities for success. In 2017, she co-authored Made in Place, Small-Scale Manufacturing and Placemaking in partnership with Smart Growth America and funded by a grant from the U.S. Economic Development Administration. She also co-authored Discovering Your City's Maker Economy, a field guide for the National League of Cities in partnership with NLC, Etsy, and the Urban Manufacturing Alliance. And she also co-authored a chapter in Creative Placemaking, a publication by the National Endowment for the Arts. She has a Bachelor of Arts degree in Urban Planning from Cornell University and a Master's of City Planning from the University of Maryland. Following the presentation, our panelists will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime during the presentation by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. Now I'll turn it over to Ilana to get us started. Welcome, Ilana.
I'm going to just get my screen all lined up and we will get started. Thank you, Michael, for that great introduction. And it is exciting for me to be back here with the Smart Growth Network. And it is thrilling because Smart Growth is my history. It's where all of my experience really comes from. So I'm really excited to be able to be back with all of you today in the Smart Growth universe. And talk about what I do these days and my passion for small-scale manufacturing businesses and the role that they can serve in helping to bring back Main Street. As Michael said, my name is Ilana Preuss, and I'm the founder and CEO of Recast City. We are going to figure out the technical difficulties. So welcome. We are going to have an exciting conversation today, and I do welcome you to enter in questions into the question chat whenever you feel like it, and we'll make sure to get through as many of them as we can at the end of today. So just to be clear, I know most of you are planners because you're here for the AICP credits, but hopefully you're also here because you have something to do with local government, real estate, nonprofits, or small businesses. Because when I talk about the role of small-scale manufacturing in bringing back Main Street, we always want to think about it from a perspective of how do we work with, if we are not ourselves, how do we work with local leaders with the decision-making power to act and implement? Because to me, as much as my background is in planning, and I do love planning, the plans only get so far. At some point, we have to actually implement what we're talking about. It is ultimately about action on the ground. So I always talk about who do we need to be engaging with, if it's either might be you as part of this conversation, or might be people you work with who have that decision-making power. But I have to start with some bad news, and this might be familiar to many of you if you're reading planning news with any regular frequency. We know that 80% of all of our counties are seeing a decline in working age adult population. That means a whole huge amount of our country is seeing this decline, and that is the dominant issue facing most places. We also know that income inequality in America is the highest it's really ever been since we started tracking it. So we have this out-migration going on in most places, and we have the largest income inequality we've ever seen. At the same time, we have long-standing research that shows things like how vacant buildings on a block can reduce the value of nearby properties by more than 20%. So we know that vacancy, brain drain, and inequalities are impacting the places that we live, including Main Street, in an enormous way in most places. And we need a different model. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit today. Because if we build a strong and inclusive Main Street, we can help you get your community back. Because there are so many places across the country that are still struggling to figure out how to get their community back. Their downturn might have happened 20 years ago, it might have happened 50 years ago, but they're still struggling with that. And what we're going to talk about today is really how do we turn that corner and build that strong and inclusive Main Street to create those positive economic solutions. So a little bit about myself. I was looking through the attendee list while everyone was logging in. I definitely know a handful of you, but certainly not all of the hundreds that are on this line. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. My mother was a person who made stuff. At the time, we didn't call anybody a maker. She sewed. That dress on the left is an amazing dress that she sewed for me for a semi-formal in high school. And she sewed and she quilted and she painted, and it was just her hobby. And what I later learned was that there was a whole world of artisans and makers, many of whom did it as a hobby, but many of whom also were turning it into businesses. Fast forward many years later, the picture on your right is when I had the chance to do a TEDx talk for GW, George Washington University, when I had the chance to talk about the economic power of making great places. And obviously, as people coming from a planning background, you know that making great places is really important in terms of how we're investing in places and how we're creating places. Since, in fact, almost exactly 5 years ago, when I was doing the TEDx talk, I had been, up until that point, I had been at the Smart Growth office at the Environmental Protection Agency. After that, I was chief of staff and vice president at Smart Growth America. So when I talk about having been involved in the smart growth world for a long time, I really do mean it. And then 5 years ago, I launched Recast City. And Recast City, I've had a chance to work all over the country and work with business owners, community leaders, and real estate developers to really figure out how are we making these great places, not just from a design perspective and not just from a zoning perspective and not just from a housing mix perspective, but what are we doing with businesses? And what are we doing particularly with locally owned small businesses on Main Street? And how do we use different kinds of businesses, and in my instance, really focusing on what I call small scale manufacturing businesses as a key puzzle piece that we've never engaged with. I had never heard anybody engage in around planning as a way to start solving some of these challenges. And so that's what I do. Recast City, I work across the country with different communities interested in looking at how to create more businesses, increase the number of jobs, and build great places in a way that is inclusive of their community. And yes, we do sit down around a lot of tables to get this done. So let me get back to the story. The story really is, and I'm sure you are all familiar with this, places are stuck in a default model. And this is why we're seeing this outmigration, we're seeing these inequities, and we're seeing these vacancies across the country. We have three major issues that we're really facing that people aren't that aware of, I think, of the kind of impacts that they're having. We're really, in most places, looking at economic development models truly left over from at least from the 80s. People and places are being left behind because so many places are chasing tech businesses and not thinking about the rest of their economy. And the last one should not be a surprise to me, but it always is. We're finding that real estate models, once a real estate model works, people keep building the same thing, and we end up with vanilla all over the place. And a fourth one that really I have to make sure we bring up in this is that in many places, planners and economic development staff are still working in separate silos, which is shocking because I feel like we've been talking about that for as long as I can remember. So the default model means that we're building places to all look the same still. We used to talk about building places to all look the same in suburbia, and now we're just talking about doing it in more urban settings, from small cities to big cities and everything in between. And what we're going to talk about today is really how to ditch that default model to make sure it benefits your main street, invest in a better way, and then really build a thriving place on your main street through some key steps. Oh, and there's some 3 secrets I'll throw in there too. So economic development model from the 80s. Yes, 80s hair band. If you don't remember it, you should look up the pictures. Our economic development strategy really is stuck in the 80s, or in some cases stuck in the 70s. When we look at how we are doing economic development, we're chasing big business still. We used to call it chasing the smokestacks. Now we should call it chasing tech. Most communities are only looking at who are their biggest businesses, and they're not thinking about who's in the pipeline and how they're going to grow those businesses to create more jobs that are never going to leave town. In many cases, most communities are trading away their future. They're giving away tons of money on recruitment of these big businesses to lure them into town, and they're spending money that could be incredibly beneficial to their local businesses. And a lot of jurisdictions have different kind of economic development incentives that are based on job creation, but the incentives are you can only qualify for these incentives if you're creating lots of jobs at once, at least 10 at a time, as opposed to 10 over time, or they're only for high income jobs, and nobody is looking at incentives for middle income jobs that could really support a family. Second, we know that people and places are being left behind, and these obviously do connect to each other. We have so many stories of places that have bottomed out and emptied out across the country. We know that venture capital is the thing that everybody talks about in terms of job creation, and that it really is focused on just a few places in the country, and it's only focused on businesses that we call unicorns, right? Who's going to find the next unicorn? They want to find a business that's going to go from 0 to $2 billion in the next 3 years. And those are the only businesses that are getting major investments these days. And we also know that there are problems with the opportunity zones. I'm going to assume that most of you are familiar with opportunity zones. If you're not, feel free to ask questions when we get to Q&A. But we know that opportunity zones really are benefiting places that were shovel ready, that had a high rate of return already invested in it, and are really, in many cases, potentially going to create tons more of displacement in those hot markets, and let alone not benefit the cooler markets that we have in the country. Oops, I think I went too far. And then we know that the research is only getting worse in terms of the divisions and extremes in our income gaps. We know that it's not just because of historical injustices, really interesting research that came out about this. It's also about access to unequal jobs that make unequal income now, and how much that impacts where we are today and where families are going in the next 20, 30 years, let alone historic injustices. So we have to look at how do we close the racial wealth gap, how do we close that pay gap, And job creation is a part of it, but also business ownership becomes a part of it. And the third thing is that we realize that once we talk about a real estate model that works, and real estate community has figured out that there are different models that work in suburbia, and lo and behold, they figured out that there's a model that works in more urban areas, they keep building the same thing. And I'm really shocked at this one, I have to say, but when we talk about short stick build like this, it's vanilla. It doesn't show us that this is in any particular place in the country. And real estate values drop over time if it looks like everywhere else. We had the same kinds of pictures about suburbia and strip malls, and now I seem to be having the same conversations about this in cities as well. Everybody who's getting this mixed-use development is getting a coffee shop or a juice bar or a CrossFit, and the places where these mixed-use developments don't pencil, they're not getting any development, and they're not getting any of this because the cost of construction is so high. And historically, we've spread retail like really expensive peanut butter across the whole area of the country. Anywhere we've lived, malls that are now emptying out. And in many cases, it's also downtowns that got rezoned to say, put mixed use everywhere. But mixed use is actually a pretty expensive kind of construction if you're looking at it in vertically in one building versus as neighbors. And so all of a sudden we start looking at local businesses not being able to afford that space, or development not happening because the lease cost or the rent of the spaces is going to be a lot lower than the price, than the cost of construction. And on top of that, there are a lot of communities where the approval process keeps getting longer, which obviously costs time and money. And don't get me wrong, I am 100% for community engagement, and this is a huge part of what I do, but predictability also needs to be a part of that. And all of this is getting piled up together in this economic tornado to really show us that we're stuck in a lot of places. So I talk to different communities all over the country every week that are trying to figure out, how do we get out from underneath this? We still have tons of vacant storefronts in on our main street and in our downtown. We have local businesses, but we don't know who they are or how to help them. And we can't figure out how to get anybody to believe in this place. And people are leaving. The youth are leaving and not coming back. And the answer really is that investment and growth we know can do good, but we have to do it with intention and purpose. And when I talk about intention and purpose, I don't think anybody ever says, I'm going to go do this without intention and purpose. But I think we have to do it with different intentions and purpose in mind, both in terms of which businesses we're engaging, how we're engaging them as one set of it, but also to what outcome, and who should be benefiting from our investments and from the growth, and being really, really specific and honest about what that means. So the new path forward that I talk about in my work with Recast City is all about these 4 paths or parts of the path. 1 is we need to invest in the people who live there. 2, invest in the place with those people. 3 is create a new structure to support, scale, and invest in all of that. And then to think, lastly, think long-term, but act now. And I'm all for long-term comprehensive economic development strategies, and I'm all for long-term master plans to redevelop all of downtown. But we have to pair it with the short-term action list that's 3 months out, that's 6 months out, that's maximum 9 months out. So we start changing things now and getting people to believe in now, and the potential to bring back Main Street now while we're working on the long term. So there's 3 secrets to the new economic reality. And I hope that you see Main Street in all of these. Right, we know that place is key to economic strength. The places that are investing in placemaking, that look like a place that is loved, is finding its economic strength. It's attracting people, it's having people from the community spend money there, and it's bringing in money from outside the jurisdiction. Second, we know that unique is really key. So that if every place looks like each other, that you don't have that placemaking that is so effective in attracting spending dollars and attracting businesses and attracting visitors and the residents. So we have to look at what is unique about our community as a way to create that longevity of investment. And third, we know that social connections are key to all of this. And when I talk about social connections, I'm not just talking about neighbor to neighbor, and I'm all for neighbor to neighbor, everybody sit down at a big table and have dinner together. We do it with people all the time. But I'm also talking about social connections between business owners. And there's been plenty of studies over the last bunch of big disasters that have befallen different parts of the country, is that the business owners that have the strongest social connections with other business owners are more likely to both last out the disaster and be able to get back into business faster versus going out of business. So we know that building up the social connections between local business owners becomes key to economic resilience. Oh, right, and Main Street and small scale manufacturers help us get to all of these, and that's what I'm about to tell you about. So small scale manufacturing, this is why we're all here today, right? You guys know all about Main Street, but maybe not so much about small scale manufacturing. Small scale manufacturing to me is this missing piece for the solution. When I did my work with Smart Growth America and at the EPA Smart Growth Program, I worked on housing options and transportation options, and we talked about jobs, housing balance, and all those things, but we never talked about which jobs, what kinds of businesses, and who makes the biggest difference for community reinvestment in a way that is inclusive of the community that's there. And I did a whole bunch of research back in 2013 that really showed that there's this missing piece. And you can call them product businesses, or I call them small scale manufacturing businesses, but they're really essential to a lot of what we're trying to achieve. Small scale manufacturings provide us with a whole bunch of benefits. First of all, they give us a reason to gather. This is an amazing street festival that was in Baltimore called REM Fest that happens every year if you ever come through Baltimore. And the whole side of all the sides of the street are lined by booths of local artisans and local small scale manufacturers, people who are producing some kind of tangible good that they can replicate or package and sell. Because people are excited to come out not only for the music, but to support local businesses, to see the new products being created by locally owned businesses, and they're excited about that local production step. We also know that these business owners are incredibly diverse, and so that if we build a community of business owners from scratch that is inclusive of our demographic diversity, we can do this in small scale manufacturing. We have an amazing opportunity. Doesn't matter, entrepreneurs of color, immigrant populations, people of different abilities, all these different communities that are often underrepresented when we look at a local chamber of commerce or a local economic development corporation. We have an ability to build this inclusive business community of owners when we look across the small scale manufacturing community. Third, it fills our storefronts. This is an amazing business. She obviously makes soaps, but if you were in her shop, you would see to the left of this picture, she has this huge cauldron where she mixes up the soaps and pours it into a mold where it cools. She is in a storefront where she can do both her retail sales and her production in one place. And there are many, many small scale producers who can be in storefront doing exactly that, doing their production, selling it both on site and online, and being a vibrant storefront for your community. And last, they can increase property value. This is Zeke's coffee shop. The front of it is a coffee shop. The back, they do their coffee roasting, and they both sell some of their coffee in bags on site, but mostly they use this as a base to do their production for their wholesale distribution around the entire DC area. And so wholesale distribution goes out the back door, right? They can do production and retail in one space. And lo and behold, by filling a storefront that didn't have that much going on this block, there are tons of restaurants and tons of shops that have started to come into this block over time. And lastly, it's important to remember that these businesses attract more business owners. When your local business owners feel valued and feel like there are programs supporting them and the local government cares about them and is helping them find space on Main Street, then they tell other people. And I will give you one example. We worked with Knoxville, Tennessee a couple of years ago. And Knoxville, Tennessee announced that it was going to be the maker city and does very public promotion of their annual conference and of programming and curriculum to help their businesses grow. And I know small scale manufacturers from all over the country who have turned to me and say, what do you know about Knoxville? I'm thinking of moving there. So if you want to think about attraction of more businesses to your community, taking care of your own is an excellent way of getting there. So in reality, these give us all of the pieces of a thriving Main Street. But we have to know who these businesses are before you can even start thinking about going after them for your Main Street. And I just want to be really clear, maybe this is the planner in me, be really clear about some of the definitions of the different kinds of spaces and how they can engage around your Main Street. First is a makerspace. A makerspace is a really specific thing. It's a community space. It's open to the public, and you have access to shared tools. The tools might cover wood and metal. They might cover sewing, CNC routers, 3D printing. It depends on the size of the makerspace. But it's community oriented. It's open to the public, to hobbyists, to people who want to tinker with things. And usually it's open with a membership and a set of classes as well. It can be used for small business development, and it can be used for workforce development programming, but only if that specific kind of programming is added to it. Second is a shared commercial kitchen or a shared wood shop. I'll talk about a shared commercial kitchen because that's what people have heard of the most. A shared commercial kitchen is where businesses, and it's only for small businesses in this instance, businesses can come and use a kitchen bay for a set of hours and produce their product in a health inspected stamp of approval commercial kitchen. And it's much cheaper for them to use that for their production instead of having to build out their own space. And they can rent it for 5 hours a week or 20 hours a week, depending on the space. Often there's cheaper hours if you use it in the middle of the night than during the day. But these businesses then can go into that space and do their production at a lower cost than having to put out all of the capital up front for themselves. It's a very important step in between home-based food cottage businesses and businesses that are large enough to be able to open their own commercial space. Shared commercial kitchens are popping up all over the country. We can definitely talk about that if you have questions. When we see commercial shared kitchens on Main Street, sometimes it has a small food hall at the front, and then it has a commercial shared kitchen with access from the back so that it has this dual purpose. Shared wood shops, we see this in other verticals, so wood or textiles. There are spaces that are opening up with access to production, but only to small businesses in that vertical because they're focusing within that area. It's not open to the public for classes like a makerspaces. Third is an artisan or maker business. Pick a name, but stick with it. We're seeing this this has been added to zoning in many different parts of the country. Artisan businesses are, this is Katie Stack, she works in textiles. She makes bags in leather and in waxed cotton or waxed material, waxed cotton, I think. She started as a one-person business. She's now up to 4 employees in a slightly larger space than you see here, but she's still in a space that's 750 square feet. So these are businesses that she's in a production with retail space. She does her production on site. She sells some of it on site, but most of her sales are online or at major holiday pop-up markets. These are businesses, artisan businesses are generally going to be 5 or fewer people. They're still using, mostly using smaller tools. They make phenomenal storefront neighbors because you can look in the window and see things made, which is an amazing amenity for your Main Street. And these are businesses that can grow and really stay in the community over time because it's usually being created by somebody who has deep roots in the community, doesn't want to go anywhere, but with the right kind of support for scaling can create 10, 20 really solid paying jobs for the community. Then we have businesses that are doing prototyping of hardware or small batch production. Shinola, when they started, was really doing small batch production. They're a lot bigger now. But we know on the hardware side, we have people inventing drones or all different kinds of kits. And that's happening all over the country. And these businesses often can be in storefronts, at least when they're starting, because they're doing modern manufacturing. It's quiet, it's clean, they're a good neighbor, and you can see things being made. as a part of this. And then we have production at scale in the neighborhood. This is a brewery in Cincinnati called Rheingeist. They ended up buying this building, which I think is 120,000 square feet, so not so small. But what they decided to do was to keep their brewing operation in only a small part of this building because they wanted to make sure it was a place to gather. I don't know how many of you have seen the study called Soul of the Community, but it's a really great study done by the Knight Foundation a bunch of years ago that looked at small and medium-sized cities and why people feel tied to the place. And it wasn't job opportunity, it wasn't economic advancement. It came down to 3 factors. The place felt inclusive, felt included in the place. There were places to gather, and there was some aesthetic beauty, natural environment, the buildings, some aesthetic beauty about the place. And so when we think about small scale manufacturers and the ways that they're building community and places for people to gather, it becomes a really essential part of the equation. So what does this mean for a local economy? I'm glad you asked. One of the places we recently wrapped up a project is called the Loop Community Improvement District. It's in Columbia, Missouri. This might look like what part of your main street looks like today. It might look like what your main street once looked like. It might look like a corridor near where you live. But this is what the Loop Improvement District is today. It's got a lot of big parking lots. It's got a lot of setback buildings, but it used to be filled with more buildings. It used to be full of restaurants where families went to get a nice dinner at a tablecloth. And it was really a key part of the area. Now it's mostly through traffic for the community. The property owners banded together to create this improvement district and have said, we want it to be a place where business can operate and families can come together. And we did a project with them this past year, really looking at how to do this using the Recast City method, which I'll talk about a little bit. But a lot of it really comes down to getting out into the community and talking to people in their space. And so this is a meeting that we held on that corridor with people who live on that corridor, near the corridor, and people who work along that corridor, to figure out what was working and what wasn't working, both to live around there, but also to have a business around there. And what did those businesses really need? And we had a really strong attendance by business owners of product businesses because our partner did some phenomenal outreach around it. We interviewed local small-scale manufacturing businesses. This is a screen printing business that uses a very special technique, hires people from the neighborhood, is working on slowly growing, and moved into a neighborhood as part of their production because they knew they wanted to be in a neighborhood and really contribute to its energy. And they found a vacant building that they could do some simple renovations on themselves, but they knew that they were having a beneficial impact on the surrounding neighborhood as well. Our client there was phenomenal, Carrie Gertner, but she was interesting to talk about afterwards because a lot of what we do is push communities to look at the different people to talk to than they've ever talked to before. So the first question always is, well, what are small scale manufacturers and how do we find them? But then the question about how to find them is we always talk about connectors. How do we find the people who will connect you to those businesses and do it in a way really with intention and purpose, which we talked about before, so that we're ensuring that we find business owners that represent the demographic diversity of our community, so that it's not sort of an uneven representation. I believe when we're doing economic development, and when we're investing in Main Street, if we're doing it in a way that does not represent the demographic diversity of our community, then we're not doing effective outreach, and we have to do it differently. We not only need to do outreach, which means go find them, but we have to do effective engagement, which means go talk to them. And not just ask them about their opinion about a done product, but ask them what they think up front. And that's the basis of a lot of the work that we do. So Como is Columbia, Missouri. We made a recommendation to them back in the spring that they needed a commercial shared kitchen as part of the corridor redevelopment. And lo and behold, we helped them figure out which building to go after. They've negotiated a space, and they'll hopefully be open by the end of the year, which will be a shockingly fast process of 9 months from project recommendation to implementation. So when I talk about showing people that things can be done in a short term, I think as planners, I know you come from lots of different backgrounds, but as planners or as economic development staff, both local government as well as the private sector, we have to show communities that things can happen in the short term. We don't just need to focus on the long-term stuff, and we have to find a way to really take bite-sized work out of it for them. And that's a lot of what I focus on with Recast City, is that combination of the smart growth and the placemaking mixed in with the economic development, drilled down in a way that we can look at actions in the short term, both on business development, how do we support these small scale manufacturers once we find them, but also on real estate development along the target corridor. And and we work with communities that are ready to make something happen, and that's obviously not everywhere, but this is how we work with communities to bring Main Street back to life, right? It's about filling those storefronts. It's about making a unique place that really does reflect the unique talents and skills and personality of the community. And it's by doing it in a way that is inclusive of the entire community as well. That includes programming and branding, but it really comes down to finding those businesses in the community that may never have been at the table before, to work with them to get there. And we work with communities then to figure out how do we help local businesses grow and add more living wage jobs to the community. We know that there's this huge income inequity going on in the country, and by adding more middle income jobs within our community, we're going to help address that. But also by helping more people be their own business owners, regardless of who they are, where they come from, where they immigrated from, their background, their history, their various abilities. If they are entrepreneurial, we should have a way of helping them grow their business and then grow for their personal income and wealth as well. Because like I said, we know we can create loved and thriving communities. And that's really essentially why I do what I do, because I do believe that every place should be loved and every community should feel like it's thriving for the people who live there. And it's up to them to define what they want, how they want it, and what it should feel like. So we work with communities really that are done with that default model we talked at the beginning, that are ready to create a place with value, a place that is unique, and a place that does connect with new people and business owners that may never have been at the table before, and to find solutions that are tried and true in different parts of the country, but may never have been at the table, or may have never been tried in the community that we're talking to. But it does take a lot of leadership to get there. And so we do work in partnership with local leaders. Every time we work with a client, it really is in partnership, because we want to make sure that the local community or the local real estate developer or foundation or nonprofit really owns those relationships with the business owners and the connectors and the property owners at the end of the project as well. So we offer 3 different kinds of work. We run a Recast City Masterclass. It's only run twice a year, and it's really about teaching community leaders, planners, economic development staff how to do all of the things that I was talking about. How do you find the right local businesses? How do you build that more inclusive and resilient business community? How do you bring small scale manufacturing businesses out into the open, and really help increase confidence in Main Street? The masterclass is a learning cohort. It's done nationally over Zoom. It's representatives from cities all over the country, but everybody gets the coaching, everybody gets the tools, and there's worksheets, and it's super hands-on. But we only run it twice a year, and we just closed this fall's national cohort. It'll open again in the spring. If you're interested in it, you can email me. I'll give you the information. We also offer a masterclass on the road, where we come to a community and we actually run this training in a day. It's not quite as deep because it's in one day, but we do run that learning cohort on site or for a conference as invited. Secondly, we do a Recast Boost on site, and this is what we did with Columbia, Missouri, or the first of 2 things we did with Columbia, Missouri. It's working with a community over 4 months. It is really about deep community engagement of business and property owners and civic leadership, identifying those small scale manufacturing businesses, the connectors, who needs to be at the table to make sure that we understand the community, but also so you can implement and take action at the end of the work, like we did in Columbia, Missouri. And really touches on all of these different pieces. And that's a 4-month engagement. And then subsequent to that, with Columbia, Missouri, we did a Recast Boost coaching, which is a one-on-one coaching for implementation. Since we've been on site, we can help really be a chief of staff, a project manager, an extension of the staff, and a researcher sort of all at once for the community, and really help you drill down into implementation over a 2 to 4 month period. So if you're interested in more information about Recast City, or about how to do some of the pieces that I was talking about today, or even just on more articles about what is small scale manufacturing and its benefit to your work, you can sign up for our newsletter at recastcity.com, or you should feel free to email me, Ilana@recastcity.com. I'd be happy to talk with you about it. It is really exciting to me to get to take everything that I learned from the world of smart growth over 20-something years and apply it all into one community at a time, and really drill down into how to make that place truly thrive. And part of that is bringing small scale manufacturing to the table, but obviously everything else I've ever learned from smart growth always bears into that as well at some point. So I think it's important to remember before I wrap up and go to questions, why we do this. We do this because I do believe that every place should have an opportunity to have a thriving economy, to have a place where people want to gather and be together and be proud of that community, but also a place where people are proud of their jobs and proud of their businesses, and know that they are valued as a business owner in their community, and know that their job is valued as well, and feel proud of that opportunity. And know that they not only have the public sector behind them, but also the private sector supporting them for the long haul, because we want to make great places that people are proud to call home. And with that, I will leave you with some of my contact information, email address, Twitter, website, you name it, we're out there. Also on LinkedIn is where I post lots of articles about what other places are doing. But I'd be happy to take any questions you have now.
Okay, thank you, Ilana. So throughout the webinar, we've been assembling questions posed by our audience, and we'll now move into the question and answer session. And if you can turn your webcam on, Ilana, we'll have you be visible to the audience as we
Let me remember how to do that. 1 second.
Okay, that's okay. I've got a couple more things to tell everybody. So you can continue to submit questions as we move into the discussion, and we'll answer as many as we can until 3:30 p.m. or 2:30 p.m. Eastern today. We're not going to go an extra hour. So one of the questions I think was posed to you, and I think I know the answer, but I'll have you answer it. So Remfest, I'm assuming that's the Remington neighborhood in Baltimore?
Yes.
Okay. So those of us who are local can go visit that. So we here in Maryland, obviously we're here in Baltimore as well, and are aware of not only Remington, but places like OpenWorks and others in Baltimore City that are based on this kind of maker concept. And you talked about this a little bit, maybe you can expound a little bit more. Was there at some point where this kind of concept of the makerspace became a strategy in and of itself that we're starting to see, like through your examples nationally, and that was kind of taking off?
So the maker movement has been around for a couple of decades. If you've ever seen Make Magazine or Make Media or gone to a maker fair, the maker movement was really established to educate people around that making stuff is cool. That's the basic idea behind it. And that everybody has the skills, the aptitude to be able to do it. And it started with maker fairs, and over the last, I would say the last decade, probably more intensively, we've seen maker spaces pop up in different parts of the country. In some communities, it's really about community engagement. So most of the maker spaces are established as nonprofits, or at least the ones that are still around for the most part are not established as nonprofits. They might be a standalone nonprofit like the one you described in Baltimore, that's OpenWorks. A lot of times in different jurisdictions, we see them in our school system now. We see them in libraries as well, and certainly at colleges and universities. And they're really focused on educating people around how do we make stuff and showing people that they have an access to it. It's very important that the makerspaces really have people who work there who are part of the community, so people feel like they belong, see people who look like themselves as part of it, and really do direct outreach into the neighborhood, which OpenWorks in Baltimore, if anybody isn't familiar with them, is a great model of it. They are an enormous makerspace. They're one of the biggest in the country. They're 34,000 square feet. A lot of makerspaces start at 3,000 square feet, just to give you a sense of scale. But we have them at all different shapes and sizes. So I'll give you a different example. In Greensboro, North Carolina, there's a makerspace called The Forge, and it's on Main Street, and it's in downtown Greensboro. And it's made an enormous difference in the identity of the end of Main Street, where there really weren't very many businesses up until then. And The Forge, the property owner who redeveloped the old buildings in this part of downtown, invited The Forge to come into the space, honestly knowing that he wasn't going to make any money off of them, but that they could create this great energy around that end of the downtown, and really helped create a thriving neighborhood around them, because they're a cool thing that you can go and see people working on machines and people making things. So makerspaces can be a phenomenal tool for neighborhood redevelopment, for Main Street redevelopment, but also for economic development. So a lot of them have started being the base where different business development programming is taught. How do you launch a product business? How do you scale a product business? Showcases, pitch competitions, and so it becomes a great center for that opportunity as well.
Okay, so in that sense, is it a type of business incubator? Because I assume business incubator could be something that's not necessarily a maker space.
So a business incubator, a makerspace does not have to incubate businesses. A lot of the makerspaces just do membership and classes and do education. They don't have programming around business development. Some of the makerspaces have made this decision to offer the programming as well, and would identify as a business incubator as well. But most traditional business incubators are providing a space for free, provides programming and certain kinds of introductions. The makerspaces, when they do have space for small businesses like OpenWorks do, those businesses are paying a rent to keep a space for their product development at OpenWorks, and they can choose to use the business development programming or not. So it's a different kind of relationship. The flip of it is in Chicago, there's a huge place called M Hub, which is not a makerspace because it's not open to the public, but it is an enormous shared tool space that has business development that is all about incubating advanced manufacturing businesses. So it is a business incubator around this kind of fabrication, but it is a very different model.
Okay, well, thanks for clarifying that for us. And I will give us a little plug here at the Maryland Department of Planning. Our Reinvest Maryland website has a lot of case studies, as well as we did a video about OpenWorks, which is on the Sustainable Growth Commission website as well. And I'll actually then move into another local question, not that we'll have everything be about Baltimore, but we actually had a question about from the Pigtown area. So it is, we at the Pigtown Main Street have a large festival like RenFest with over 70 vendors. Do we need the space available before we approach makers, or are artists? We would start with our vendors from the Pigtown Festival.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Do they need, if they already have 70 vendors, are you asking about expanding it or replacing some of the 70 vendors?
I'm getting the feeling. This is John. I'm getting the feeling that she's asking about having a maker space. Do they need the space available before they start approaching makers, or do you approach makers about, can we, to find out what the interest is? That's what I think is that's what's happening here.
Got it. So it was on the makerspace theme. So I think it's important to do engagement up front before we ever talk about space. My work always starts with, I go out and I talk to the small scale manufacturers one-on-one in their production space, because they're small business owners and they do not have time to come to a public meeting ever. It's an important thing to remember as a planner. The world revolves around them, not us. And I go out and I interview them. And that's how I find out, is there a need? And a maker space, if you want it to be focused much more on local producers. One of the questions would be, how do you find home-based businesses that might want to expand or have access to better tools than they have at home? And that really is dependent on neighborhood connectors and neighborhood outreach to find them. But I do think that that direct engagement with the community is essential before you start looking at a space, because the last thing I would want is any community to spend money on a space and then find out that nobody needs it.
Okay. A question that came in while we were talking about that was, how does one fund a makerspace?
Great question. It's really hard to do. One of the reasons I said most of the ones that are still around are nonprofit is because the for-profit model has tried a number of times, and nobody has figured out really how to make that work yet. I'll leave it at that. I do think that a makerspace is a public good, and I do think that it is important to have public investment in it. Partnerships with a library who might have available space so that rent is free, but somebody else helps run the makerspace can be a great way to get there. OpenWorks has state, federal, and city funding, as well as philanthropic funding behind them. And they use new market tax credits. They stacked a whole bunch of stuff into theirs. Other ones have really been based at a more local level. So smaller makerspaces that are more like 3,000 square feet usually start with a smaller set of tools because it's only 3,000 square feet. And so when you're doing just a sewing makerspace or just a wood makerspace, then it is going to be less expensive to start. But folks have used Kickstarter, I think, or Indiegogo. But local philanthropy and public sources of funding are really important in all of that. EDA, the U.S. Economic Development Administration, which funded a project that I just finished last year, they have a whole bunch of funding for manufacturing and education and entrepreneurship and are a great potential resource for that.
Okay. So someone has a question based on their situation. I'll read a little bit of the background here. A local school district is renovating their closed middle school building, and it might evolve into a community center space, maybe some fitness class space, maker business space, etc., shared kitchens. There isn't a local park district, and the school wants to maintain control, but what community or P3 organization would you recommend them to explore to help manage the space?
That's a good question. Usually I would say this is going to be more successful if there's a community development corporation as a third party to help do the renovation of the space and manage the tenants. I can't imagine there's a school district that really wants to do tenant management, even if they want to retain ownership of the building. The other way is to find a partnership with a local nonprofit. So if there are different nonprofits that work with local producers in a lot of different cities, St. Louis has St. Louis Makes, DC has Think Local First, Knoxville has the Knoxville Entrepreneur Center. So it might be worthwhile finding a third-party nonprofit that can partner with the school district on the operation of the space, and to put that nonprofit under contract as the operator of the space.
Okay, thank you. Another question here. Not sure if this research has been done, but have you seen an impact from cottage food laws and the demand for shared kitchen facilities?
Yeah, cottage food laws are a huge either asset or barrier, is the truth. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this term, cottage food laws dictate how much of a food-based business you can have at home, and it's at the state level. Although it gets even more stringent sometimes at the local jurisdiction level. So in some communities, you can just do jams and jellies, things that you can jar and that there's no way really that it can go bad. And in some places you can cook more or less everything that you want, but it has to be a small scale, smaller quantity. In some places they have a revenue maximum, which seems like a weird way to control for it. And so there's different variables, and there's some great resources online about different cottage food laws in different states. The places that are much more stringent, the need for a commercial shared kitchen comes up much faster, which is just logical. And so we also find that there's a great cohort effect when a whole bunch of these businesses can share a commercial shared kitchen. They also figure out how to partner with each other, or they can learn how to scale. A lot of commercial shared kitchens also provide some kind of training or access to training if the business owner wants it, or certainly access to tools that they wouldn't have at home. And so I'll give you the Columbia, Missouri example. They had heard anecdotally from people that folks wanted to scale, but hadn't really had a chance to really look at it in terms of the food businesses. And we did a whole bunch of interviews with all different kinds of business owners when we were in Columbia, Missouri. And it came through really clearly that there were a bunch of businesses that were food-based, that were well-established, and that could not grow because they did not have access to a commercial shared kitchen anywhere nearby. And it became a really clear barrier. And that's exactly what we look to find is a critical mass of people facing the same barrier. We listen really, really carefully when we do on-site work. And so those cottage food laws versus commercial shared kitchens are really essential in all of that. And then within each jurisdiction, the health department reviews sites differently. So there's a lot of super detailed rules about State Department of Ag versus local health department and who reviews what when you're looking at a commercial shared kitchen. It often depends on the kinds of products you want people to be able to create there. My recommendation is to go for whatever is the highest or the most, the biggest need. Start with there.
Okay, we got a couple questions about the regulatory aspects of this one. So I'll ask the first being, what sorts of building and zoning code issues do you find people running into when creating small manufacturing businesses downtown or in neighborhoods?
This is one of my favorite things to work on. There's lots of them. You know, I come from a planning background, so I speak zoning like most of you. There's a lot of them is the answer. So the number one barrier we find is that most places do not allow artisan businesses or small scale manufacturing in their downtown. Their commercial zone or their Main Street zone, whatever zone you use for downtown, for the most part, does not allow any kind of production going on, even as an accessory use. And so in many communities, we've helped them draft an artisan manufacturing land use definition, which they can then go in and add to, I always recommend add to all of the commercial zones. So that's the first barrier. The second barrier is that we did this with Fairfax County. They put together a great artisan manufacturing definition and added it in. And then we met with the people from the permitting side. We got people from every different part of the permitting, including fire and health. And we said, okay, let's take a scenario. We're going to put a chocolate producer with a retail frontage in 2,000 square feet in this commercial zone. Let's say that artisan is now an approved land use. How are you going to take this through? And I got radio silence. So we walked through, and what we honestly did was all we did was pose a ton of questions in that first meeting, but then the departments could go back and figure out how they were going to answer those questions when it started coming through their offices, which was an important part of the process. So there's often health or fire barriers because if somebody is making soaps, they're going to need a burner and they're going to need to be able to melt stuff, and then the fire code kicks in. And so we look at how do we create some really consistent answers for these different kinds of businesses and allow them into the storefronts as well as part of it.
Okay. I guess a similar question here. Do you have any thoughts on form-based code and its role in small-scale manufacturing economy?
Form-based code is great. I'm all for it. I think it's a great thing to use. The problem with form-based, and honestly with any kind of zoning code, is that small-scale manufacturing cannot compete with high-end retail on price. Small-scale manufacturing businesses are not going to be able to rent a retail space that somebody is looking for a big bank, a chain to fill. So the flip of it, as much as I would be happy for us just to go for form, is that we also sometimes need to look at small-scale manufacturing as a public good, and then look at, are there, especially in a hot market, do we put in requirements that 20% of the ground floor space is going to be used by local businesses in some way? But form-based codes are great and can be a key part of the solution in a community that can engage around form-based codes, as long as it doesn't limit the use, which form doesn't usually, but sometimes it walks both lines.
I understand. So we had a related question, which you might have answered earlier in your previous answer, was, do you find that traditional zoning discourages maker spaces?
It's easy to fix. It's really about adding artisan manufacturing or shared workspace as an allowable use within the code. Most places that we've worked with, it's not a big deal to add it as an allowable land use. But it's an important first step. Maker spaces are a little bit harder sometimes, depending on what kinds of tools. So some maker spaces do have louder tools like wood and metal shop, and those are going to be hit by different permitting requirements. But the maker spaces that are smaller, that are sewing and CNC routers and laser cutters and 3D printing are generally going to be a lot quieter. So we used to have one near me that was in the basement of an office building. So it was just an allowable use because it didn't have any fumes coming out of it and any noise coming out of it. So it doesn't have to be a barrier.
Okay. Kind of transitioning to another area, would you recommend that a community raise capital to open and operate a shared kitchen once the need has been identified? The cost is not currently in the budget. Can you help identify resources to assist a community in making this happen?
The answer is yes. And I think that figuring out the financing of that up front is really essential, because you don't want to open something and then close it back down. That's something we absolutely work with communities on, and whoever asks that question, if you want to email me afterwards and set up a time to talk, I'd be happy to talk about it.
Okay. Let me look down here. So in rural areas, there may not be a main street. Are there examples of where the principles of promoting small-scale manufacturing to promote thriving communities has been applied in rural communities?
Yeah, I've worked in a lot of rural communities. Even if the main street is only 1 block long, there's still a center to the community in some way. It might not be a big main street, it might be 1 or 2 blocks. So I still look at that as the center of the community and work with communities about how do we make that center a thriving place so that people want to come and congregate there and feel like there's a place. Communities that are under 2,000 people, that gets a little bit harder. But that's the vast minority of the places that we have of our, 30,000 jurisdictions in the country. So I do think that there is a way to think about this. I did a project with Vassar, Michigan, which is 2,000 people. And they actually had a T of a main street, and it was a 3-block main street, and they had empty storefronts. And we did this great project working with them on how do they find the small scale manufacturers that are in their town? Is there a need for them to have their own small commercial shared kitchen? And how do you use that as an asset to really help fill some of the storefronts that they have? So I think this is actually a phenomenal tool for rural towns and cities, because there are so many people who in many cases are making stuff at home, sometimes as a 2nd or 3rd job and sometimes as a hobby. But by bringing them out of the woodwork and really showing them that they're wanted and in fact they're needed, and putting them into storefronts, we really can rebuild this energy around our rural main streets and the pride of working and living in that community.
Okay. This is a more specific question. Are market studies done as a foundation to identify businesses that may be lacking in the community?
I assume that means in my work with Recast City.
Mm-hmm.
Market studies are generally, and I'm sure you guys already know this, market studies are generally done off of big databases. Cluster analysis or housing analysis and demand comes off of big databases out of Esri and other sources. Nobody, and I've been working on this for years now, nobody has a database of small scale manufacturers. So we do on the ground quantitative and qualitative analysis through one-on-one and small group meetings with business owners. Is it enough interviews to be a full market analysis? In some cases, when we do an on-site, yes, but in other cases, it's not quite enough that I would call it a full market analysis. But there's no other way for us to get information about this business sector yet, because all of the different data sources, including ones that are great about other kinds of businesses, they're just not going to capture this community well enough. Home-based businesses are always left out of the databases. Often solo entrepreneurs are left out. It doesn't matter if they're planning on scaling their business to 1,000 people or 10 people. If it's a solo business, it's probably not in there. Somebody who is part-time but wants to go full-time is not going to be captured in there. And businesses that are 5 or 10 people are often left out of most conversations in the city. The other issue that we have is that a lot of small-scale manufacturing businesses, when you open a business, you have to list yourself as one of the NAICS codes. I don't know if people are familiar with that. We can talk about that if you want. But in the NAICS codes, you just pick which one you think makes the most sense. So a lot of businesses I know that are bricks and mortar, where they're doing production and retail in that space, they list themselves as retail, even though most of their revenue is coming from the production and the sales that they're doing through wholesale. So a lot of the time we can't use those databases to get an accurate picture of what's going on. I've been working with a lot of database people to see if we can get a better combination of numbers that are out there. So the answer is yes on the market study, but it is done through those one-on-one interviews and small group interviews of the small scale business owners in the community, not through the big generic databases.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's a question I think maybe gets to part of your point here in terms of engaging with the people in the community. So how do you engage multiple adjacent vacant property owners to work together and think outside the box?
That's a great question. And the answer really is we have to inspire them and we have to get them to believe. And when that isn't possible, we have to get them to sell. And I know it's not as easy as that, but part of the reason that I push to sit down with property owners, at least the local property owners, and in as many projects as we can, is because we have to sit down with them and understand what barrier are they facing. So we've sat down with different property owners that say, I would love to have a business in there, but I can't afford the renovation. So then we know what barrier they are facing. If there's a property owner that says, yeah, I'm not interested, I'm just waiting to sell it in 20 years when something happens, that's a different kind of problem. And there are certain policy fixes we can look at for that. Speculation becomes a different kind of problem, similar to that one. But a lot of times properties are vacant because there's some really specific barrier to it, or they don't believe that the market's coming back, or they need some kind of economic incentive to get there. So we sit down with property owners to understand exactly what's going on. And what the reality is we're not really guiding people to think outside the box. We're sort of saying, be in your comfy box, just invite different people to join you in it, right? So we're saying, let's renovate the storefronts. I'm not talking new construction. I'm just talking about renovating the storefronts we have, or the whatever building is there, and let's start getting businesses into it now. Let's get activation into it now. And there's some great examples. I just had, what was the talk I just heard? I was just at the International Downtown Association's conference, and there was a speaker from LA and from Memphis about their downtowns and how they're activating their storefronts. And there are so many different ways that those business improvement districts are working with property owners in a way that really shows how these spaces can be activated. And sometimes it means an outside party needs to take on some of the risk to get it started, to create that proof of concept, which is an important thing to keep in mind.
Okay. What role do complete street designs and investments play in placemaking for actionable strategies that support small-scale manufacturing?
Great question. I love complete streets. I miss working on them from my days at Smart Growth America. Very important. Complete streets means, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, that everybody gets to use that right of way. People, bikes, cars, whatever other mode of transportation, bus, transit. And especially on Main Street, complete streets is essential, right? We need to have the wide sidewalks where people feel safe and protected. We need the on-street parking, both to protect the sidewalks and make people feel protected, but also so there is that feeling of being able to drop in, even if most of the parking is behind the buildings or off-site a block away. We need to make sure we have slow speed so that it is safe for people to cross the road, and the cars, honestly, on a two-way street there have a chance to slow down and see what shops are there. So complete streets are very important to Main Street, probably more so than specifically to small scale manufacturing, but they are essential to really having that thriving place that brings people together and gives us an opportunity to gather.
Okay. Do you have any suggestions on how to find out where your home artisans are located and who they are?
Great question. Yes. This is the first thing we do with every client we ever work with, is we help them find those people. And I'll give you a couple of tricks of the trade to get you started. One is almost every community has holiday pop-up markets coming up over the next couple months. I download every list that goes online, and I pull out everybody who is a local business. And honestly, it's retail, it's grassroots outreach, and I ask those people who they know, and that's how we start the list. We also go through connectors in the community, so different civic leaders, neighborhood leaders, faith leaders, people who are working in a specific neighborhood and are known and trusted by that neighborhood. We ask them to get the word out to help us identify businesses. Once we can get a list of about 20 to 30 businesses in a community, then we go in and we start interviewing them and understanding who else is there and who we're missing. But it really is that kind of iterative process with that kind of grassroots on the ground outreach.
Okay. Here's a question is, I guess, related to outreach. Have you worked with chambers of commerce previously? And if so, have you found them to be engaged partners?
Yes, sometimes. I've worked with some amazing chambers of commerce. There are a lot of local chambers of commerce that know that the local small business community is essential to the community's success, to its brand, its identity, its economy, all of those pieces. So I had a wonderful opportunity a couple years ago to work in Indianapolis, and the Chamber of Commerce there was a full partner in our project with the city. We were brought to town by the city, which was a partnership between the planning and the economic development departments. And they hosted us for a big event because they recognized that figuring out how to better support local businesses, especially small-scale manufacturing businesses, along their target corridors was essential. And they wanted to make sure that they were creating the right business development programs, but also supporting and branding this part of the business community. So that was a great partnership. That being said, there are plenty of chambers of commerce that only pay attention to really big businesses and don't give local small businesses, let alone small scale manufacturing businesses, the time of day. And so it really does depend on who is the leadership and who is part of the Chamber of Commerce in the community.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, what is the most important factor in luring small scale manufacturing or product businesses downtown?
Building a relationship with them. There's really nothing like it. And it's the reason that in every on-site project we do, we go and we meet with the small scale manufacturers where they work now. And we talk to them on their turf, because we have to understand what they need and what are their barriers, but we also need to build a personal relationship with them, right? Anybody in commercial leasing can tell you that leasing a space is about a personal relationship. And I think sometimes we think we have a magic wand. I do talk about my magic wand on every project, but sometimes we think we have a magic wand where we just have an empty space, so obviously somebody's going to fall through the roof and want it. And it really is about building relationships with new people who may never have thought about being downtown, understanding what their barrier is to being downtown. There are a couple communities I've worked in that have grants because of different financing mechanisms. They have grants to be able to support the build out of a space to become retail again, or to rehab an old retail space so that a business can come back in onto the main street or into downtown. So we need to build that relationship with them. We need to understand what their barriers are, and then we need to show them that we're actually going to help them get through the process, because a lot of these businesses are either going to be home-based, they're going to be in industrial areas, they're going to be tucked in out of the way places, even though they would be amazing on Main Street. And we need to show them that we're going to make it easy for them to move in, affordable, and we're going to really streamline that permitting process for them so they're not going to be out on the ledge all by themselves. Businesses want to know that they're wanted. It's a pretty essential part of the process.
Okay, thank you. Our state's farm businesses want to diversify and connect people with their farming operations, but some planners have concerns that this will commercialize rural areas and mean lost opportunities on main streets. Have you seen smart growth, small-scale manufacturing as a way to diversify farms and connect people with the land-based economy?
So I think I'm going to give an answer, and hopefully I'm answering the right question out of that. We're seeing a number of farms, probably not that many, honestly, out of all the farms there are. A number of farms are creating their own commercial kitchens to take some of their products and turn them into value-added food packaged products, because they've found that selling the packaged product, the jar, whatever it is, the thing that they've processed into something else, is a higher value product than the raw thing coming off of their farm. And so we're starting to see this relationship. In fact, in some communities, there's one farm in a couple communities that have opened their own commercial shared kitchens because they don't need that commercial kitchen all the time. So they do lease it out to other people. That's one place that we've seen this connection between small scale manufacturing and the farm-based economy, and I think is really important. We did a project in Grants Pass, Oregon, which is a small rural city of 30,000 people surrounded by these amazing farmlands. And the more we interviewed business owners there, we found that a lot of people actually had been attracted to opening a food product business there because of the amazing produce they could get from the surrounding farm community. So there definitely is a relationship there.
Great, thank you. And thanks to everybody who's submitting questions. We do have time for a few more if people want to submit them. So the next one here is, I heard that a restaurant in a downtown local to where I live moved because they wanted to smoke meat and could not in their current location. Do you have a list of maker businesses and the specific challenges they face in making downtown, as well as best practices in zoning that is likely to cover these specific barriers?
I do not have a standalone list that I can just hand over to you, although that would be an interesting project to do. Usually we do it based on what we find in the community. So all of our work really is based on what barriers that community is finding. Smoking meats is a really interesting question unto itself. A lot of what we do in different projects is we figure out what those barriers are, and then we go and we chase down the answers. So if it's not something that I have just, on my computer, like artisan manufacturing land use definition, which I can help anybody adopt tomorrow, we go and we figure out who has dealt with that thing, and we find that solution. So the smoked meat question is a great question. There are some places where they had a small brewery that opened up in downtown and it wanted to expand, but that community had a maximum footprint size for breweries in the downtown. And so instead of thinking, hey, we actually want to keep this energy in our downtown, they said, no, we're not changing that limit. And they actually lost a business and a huge energy center for their city. So a lot of it does come down to the politics of that decision making. And a lot of times we also talk about who do we need to talk to around the politics of that decision making. But I do not have a standalone list of all the different barriers that every community has faced. It is pretty unique to each community's zoning code, its permitting process, and the kinds of businesses that are there already. Because I do believe that it is most important to find the businesses and support the businesses that are already there in that community, help them thrive, and then figure out how to grow more and attract more.
Okay. Thank you. Next one is, while zoning for these uses might be easy, do you have any advice on how such shared maker spaces or shared commercial kitchens in old Main Street buildings can meet building codes?
They can. I've seen it. I'm happy to connect people up through projects. We connect people up with folks that have gotten it done. And it really oftentimes means sitting down with the health department and the fire department and the State Department of Ag to figure out exactly all of those pieces. But most of the projects I've seen are in existing buildings. A lot of times they're in historic buildings too, because those are our beloved main streets a lot of the times. So it's definitely possible, and it's definitely happening in different communities. It takes drilling down into the specifics of that place.
Okay. Can you point to a community with a very good example of artisan manufacturing code they have implemented? Or artisan, sorry.
Yeah, so Knoxville has done a good job with it. Nashville has, Fairfax County has, Indianapolis has an artisan manufacturing land use code. Those are the ones just off the top of my head. I believe I'm trying to remember if I have a blog on zoning or not. I'm not sure I do. I have a whole bunch of blogs. If anybody's interested, on recastcity.com, there's blogs on all sorts of different topics about financing and about definitional information and about the demand for this stuff. You're welcome to go check them out and use them as a resource however you would benefit from it.
Okay. We'll maybe put a couple links on our archive page.
Thanks.
What kind of freight mobility is needed for these small scale manufacturing operations, and how does that work with complete street requirements?
Yeah, that's a great question. Most of these businesses are not using 18-wheelers. So if we think about small scale manufacturing, I usually think about, if it's a smaller city, I usually define it as 1 to 20 people in terms of employees. If it's a bigger city, 1 to 50. But even so, that's looking at a space that is anywhere from 10 to 20,000 square feet maximum in a downtown. So if you think of a CVS or a Walgreens, it's going to have much less shipping than any one of those. So if we're already figuring out how to accommodate any kind of pharmacy, we're certainly going to have no problem with small scale manufacturing. The only one that sometimes has bigger shipping is the brewery. If you have a brewery that isn't just selling on site but wants to scale its production for distribution, that sometimes has bigger truck needs. Most small scale manufacturers are getting shipments in by large van, not even by big truck. And so freight really isn't that big of an issue for any of these, no different than any other store.
Okay, thanks. So we have a few more minutes, a couple more questions, and if anybody else wants to submit some, please do. So is it essential for maker spaces to be on Main Street? Sometimes industrial zones that need to be reoccupied are not on the main drag. Attracting the public into more industrial buildings or areas is not as easy as Main Street commercial corridors. Do you have any experience or suggestions about these types of maker spaces?
I think there's a purpose for different things. So when we have a maker space that is more centrally located to a main street or to a neighborhood, we're really telling the community that this is a community space. When we put a maker space in an industrial area, we're really telling people that this is much more of a business space, right? Where something is, the way it looks, the way it's promoted, all impact who feels like they belong and how they are a part of that space. So a lot of older cities, though, have industrial areas right next to downtown. So I'm never going to be the one that says makerspace has to be on Main Street. You might want something else on the main drag of Main Street, but a block back, 2 blocks back, or an industrial area that's right next to downtown in some of our older cities might be a great way to start building energy there. I do believe that I believe there is something called an industrial Main Street where we can have businesses doing production, but still have it be a place where people can walk and look in windows and see what's going on. So I do think there's a connection between these two things.
Okay. What are the successful ways you have gotten economic developers to think about chasing this type of use? And parenthetically, a question as, and yes, I would say our economic developers are still operating in the 80s model and giving big incentives. Also, our local maker spaces where space is cheap at a near vacant shopping mall, unfortunately not in our downtown. Not sure what ways to get a makerspace downtown where space is more expensive. How do we do that?
Right. The cost of space is a whole webinar unto itself. We could talk about that for hours. The first part of that question, though, wasn't about cost of space. It was about, sorry,
how do you
one more
get
time?
Developers to think about?
And the old economic model. So yes, so most cities are still most jurisdictions are thinking about chasing businesses. When they think about small scale manufacturing chasing, the only things they're thinking about are advanced manufacturing and biotech. Those are both product businesses, but they both are tech-based, right, of different kinds. I think those are really important. I live in an area with tons of biotech. I've worked in areas with tons of advanced manufacturing. I think they're really important. They are one subset of our small-scale manufacturing industry. I really recommend in each case for economic development, possibly in partnership with the planning department, to do this on-the-ground engagement. So I find and engage and talk to small-scale manufacturing businesses that are across different verticals that do represent the demographic diversity of the community. You're going to find all different kinds of products, all different kinds of assets that are already in your community, and probably all they need is a little bit of business development. And there's a specific set of business we recommend for small-scale manufacturing businesses if they're not there. So there's that piece of it. I think it's not an either or. Most jurisdictions are not going to stop chasing big stuff. I'm in the DC area. Every jurisdiction around here chased Amazon. Only one of them got it. It's not like they're going to stop doing that. But at the same time, we can actually show them short-term actions that really do create these really on-the-ground successful impacts to bring more business owners to the table and help them grow and thrive as a business. So that's the grow versus chase dichotomy. In terms of the cost of space, the cost of space is the huge issue in all of this. So in hot markets or in places where the downtown is hot, it's really hard to find space for small scale manufacturers, let alone for maker spaces. There are some public policies we can engage with around a space for local businesses, but we can also say that it's okay to be a couple blocks off of Main Street and that we want to make sure that these businesses can stay close in. The problem is with mixed use, and I love mixed use, and I've been a proponent for mixed use my whole career in that world of crazy smart growth, is that mixed use just says everything is allowed. It doesn't say these things are what we prefer. And so looking at policies that are, for instance, inclusive housing policies that say a minimum X% of housing will be affordable to our low and moderate income, we rarely find a place, and there's only one jurisdiction so far that I know of that is anything even close to this, that says it is a public good for us to have affordable commercial space for our locally owned businesses. So we want X% of ground floor, especially in new construction, to be affordable. Or for a community development corporation or a land trust to go in and say, we will reserve space that is affordable for community owned businesses over time. So there's a lot of different ways to get there. It's one of the sets of solutions we work on with communities where the space is expensive. But often, you're right, Main Street might be too expensive, and we have to look adjacent to Main Street or adjacent to downtown as the space where this is going to go. Most places, there's plenty of other places, neighborhood level, that might need redevelopment, old industrial areas that are in the city that might need reinvestment that we can look at.
Great. Okay, a couple last questions. Are any schools or colleges used for community kitchens, and what are the obstacles to using them?
That's a great question. I'm sure the answer is yes, but I can't think of who off the top of my head. The one in Columbia, Missouri is actually going to lease space from Mizzou, University of Missouri, for that commercial shared kitchen. So that's going to be in partnership, but it's going to be run separate from the university, which is essential. There are definitely some churches that have turned their church kitchen into a commercial shared kitchen as well, and doing that with a mission-driven effort. Mission-driven commercial shared kitchens, like the one in Massachusetts called Commonwealth Kitchen, is another model of how to get there that's really focused on reaching an underserved population. So there's a lot of different ways to get there.
Okay, so I think the last question will be kind of based on your work here, Ilana. Are your clients typically governmental, or are there other community-based groups that hire you?
Thank you for that question. So I get hired by local government, real estate developers, nonprofits, and foundations who really want to create a thriving place and know that the combination of planning and economic development is that connection is essential. And we get there by engaging with small scale manufacturing businesses. Obviously, it's only one piece of what we actually do at the end of the day, but it's one way to get people really excited about what's possible in the community. So we do work across the board with those entities.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ilana, for answering all these questions and for a great presentation. This will conclude our Bring Back Main Street with Small-Scale Manufacturing, the who, the why, and the how. I'd like to offer a great big thank you to Ilana for a great presentation, and to all those who attended, and to John Coleman, our communications guru, who helps to put all of this together. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org later this week. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and our weekly e-newsletter for details on other future webinars, including one on December 4th with Joe Barrage of Urban Strategies in Toronto, entitled Perfect City, based on his new book. Have a great day.